Hello everyone, and as always, welcome back to the Vanishing Hour. Today we are covering the final leg of this 3-part explosive episode regarding the vanishing of the Viking Sally. In episode 1, we went over the events of the ship from the time she was built in 1980 until 1987, when her second murder was committed. German students Klaus and Bettina were savagely attacked in the middle of the night, 1 year after a businessman was stabbed and strangled to death aboard the ship. Sadly, Klaus did not survive the attack, and the case technically remains unsolved today, despite the police's main suspect being acquitted of the crime. In part 2, we went over what happened to the ship after these events, with particular attention to the sinking in September of 1994. The ship sank in under an hour in the middle of the night in the Baltic Sea. The Swedish government confirmed in their evaluation and report that it was a visor door malfunction at the time that caused the sinking. However, all the evidence pointed at a more sinister reason. Theory 1 was presented by the German shipyard that built the now named MS Estonia. They performed their separate investigation and concluded that a hole in the hull had to have caused the rapid sinking. They had a lot of evidence to support this finding. However, they claimed that the hole was caused by explosives that were aboard the ship. This theory led to many speculating about the hole, and the press was then added for an additional investigation. However, the government put up literally every roadblock they legally could to prevent an investigation, thwarting several major attempts to confirm the finding of a hole. They went so far as to make it a crime in their country to dive to the Estonia. They attempted to bury the ship in concrete underwater, and they refused to consider passenger testimonies that contradicted their reports of what happened. This only made people more suspicious, of course, and led people to think that the government was trying to hide something. We left off with the beginning of the final theory of what happened to the Estonia, and like I mentioned in the last episode, it's probably the most controversial, if you can believe that. Now, this theory stemmed from the hull hole theory and the eyewitness account of one survivor aboard the ship that night. He claimed that just after 1 a.m. Estonia time, he felt the ship collide with something, like many other passengers said they felt. He ran to the top deck, where he looked around and spotted a large illuminated mass below the waterline moving left away from the ship. Less than an hour later, the ship would be at the bottom of the sea floor. This eyewitness's account was never evaluated by the government committee when performing their accident analysis. This theory, that the ship collided with an object causing a hole in the ship and aiding severely in the rapid sinking, was largely researched by investigative journalist Stephen Davis of New Zealand, beginning shortly after the sinking. However, his investigation really took off about 4 years later in 1998. Stephen claims to have researched the sinking of the Estonia for over 20 years. He specializes in international government cover-ups, so I feel like I should kind of throw that out there as a precursor before we dig into this a little more. However, this theory does hold a lot of water. Stephen claims that from the jump he knew that there was something not right with the sinking of the Estonia, and thus piqued his interest in digging for information. He began to investigate after some of these major events we discussed. When he happened upon the sanctity agreement, he found an oddity in the nations that signed this agreement. The agreement was to pertain to the Baltic nations that had shared access to the Baltic Sea. This included Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Russia. However, for some random-ass reason, Great Britain had signed the agreement as well. Great Britain not being part of the Baltic nations at all, they have no direct access to the Baltic Sea. When he saw this, he filed a Freedom of Information Act with the British government, and in his words, he was stonewalled. A few months later, during another unrelated investigation, Stephen had interviewed a man by the name of Richard Tomlinson. Some of you may be familiar with him, but for those of you who are not, I will try to sum him up as briefly as I can. Richard was a former British MI6 agent, which is probably comparable to like a FBI agent for the US or maybe Secret Service. Richard had been canned from his job for obscured reasons, even to this day. They revoked his pension and benefits, and this obviously didn't sit well with him for any reason. So Richard essentially went on a tell-all quest. He kind of turned into, a form of a whistleblower, I guess you could say. Britain banned him from the country and prohibited him from obtaining any royalties from any published work he contributed to that regarded MI6. Now, this guy has some interesting and wild information to share. I don't know about the complete validity of a lot of it, but it's interesting, and some of it does kind of align with other known facts, so it's a little hard to dismiss. But anyway, Stephen gets wind of this guy and decides to do a piece on him. He seems interesting, and it is, investigative work. The first meeting, though, Richard pulls a document out of his briefcase and asks Stephen if he's aware of this. The document in question is a paper about the sinking of the Estonia. Weird, random, right? Considering this seemingly has no ties to Great Britain or the MI6. But wait, there's that sanctity treaty. So obviously Stephen's interest is piqued. He asks him what this has to do with MI6 or Richard himself, and Richard insists that Stephen investigate this because the MI6 were involved in a smuggling operation that was carried out by Estonia on the Estonia, and that there is a lot more lying just below the surface of this story. Now, in order to understand the relevance of the ties to the country of Estonia and Great Britain, it kind of, starts prior to 1991. So the Estonia was a country that had countlessly fought for its independence from repeated Russian, Soviet, and German invasions for decades. It tried to remain neutral in times of war, but was ultimately reoccupied by the Soviet Union in 1940, Nazi Germany in 1941, and then the USSR, where it became a subunit known as Estonian SSR. It remained part of the SSR until August of 1991, though, where it regained and has since maintained its independence. However, the country was worried about reinvasions and were insistent on making allies with larger countries in hopes of gaining protection from any future invasions. This obviously led to Great Britain and the MI6 program that they had there. This is according to Stephen's research and part of the corroboration with Richard. MI6 already had a long-standing relationship with Swedish intelligence. I said that weird. So it was an easy transition to add Estonia into the mix. Estonia's main threat was Russia, being that it directly bordered their east side. Apparently, Sweden and Great Britain felt that there was a common opponent with Russia as well, and they agreed on this, for lack of a better word, an alliance. Now, after this union, there was mild speculation that Estonia was used as a sort of middleman to transport quote-unquote stuff out of Russia through Estonia and then out through the Baltic Sea. That would then be taken to Sweden. When the sinking happened, the speculation grew stronger, and many started to add Russia into the mix by claiming that they had to have sunk the Estonia for this precise reason. Obviously, speculation is speculation, and at the time, everyone was more focused on the salvage controversy, that I don't think this theory was really a widespread one at the beginning. Plus, obviously, the government denied it. And this kind of remained a more quiet chatter in the background of this whole investigation until about 10 years after the tragedy. Following the interview with Richard Tomlinson, though, Stephen digs into the sinking, of course, and makes contact with another unnamed MI6 agent. This agent states that Russia delivered 2 very clear warnings to the West to stop transport/smuggling operations via the Estonia. Warning number 1 went through diplomatic channels to the Estonians in 1993. Allegedly, the Estonians ignored this warning. The following year, shortly before the sinking, the second warning from Russia was issued, but this time it went directly to MI6. Following the sinking, while both Swedish and Estonian nations were in mourning, Stephen claims that the government was secretly scrambling, in his words. His sources have more information to provide, though, that coincide with the next information I'm about to give. By September of 2004, the chief of customs for the Stockholm port that the Estonia would have docked at if it had made its journey successfully, his name is Lennart Henriksson, FYI, reached out to the journalist Lars Borgnäs with information he had wanted to share. Lennart said that a few weeks before the Estonia sinking, he was called into his manager's office, where he met with both his immediate boss and the regional chief of customs in Stockholm. Lennart was told that vehicles would be arriving soon and that they would be permitted onto the ship without being checked. When Lennart questioned who was requesting this, he was told it's not a request, it's an order, and it's coming down from the very top. Quote, as high as you can get, he stated. Not the king, but very high up. The first of these special vehicles arrived September 14th, exactly 2 weeks before the sinking. Lennart was there the day it arrived, and despite the orders to not check it, he claims he peeked inside anyway. He said that there were boxes that appeared to contain military electronics inside. The next vehicle arrived 6 days later on September 20th. It was a larger vehicle with twice the amount of cargo, but appeared to be the same type of cargo. The night of the sinking, Lennart was not working. He was actually on vacation, so he cannot personally confirm if there was actual shipment aboard that evening, but based on the prior 2 deliveries, it would make sense that the Estonia's last voyage had in fact another shipment aboard. When the news broke out, though, it wasn't swept under the rug and denied like you would think. The military acknowledged these findings, but they did not elaborate further on them. The public naturally was outraged, and that essentially forced the government to investigate these claims further. In 2005, the Estonian government appointed state prosecutor Margus Kurm to investigate the claims. At first, the Swedish authorities promised to cooperate, but as the line of questioning started to reach below surface level, there began to be serious issues with their responses, and ultimately it pushed Margus to come to the conclusion that none of the information they were providing could be considered reliable. The entire investigation ended up being a dead end because of the Swedish authorities' unwillingness to cooperate. The final report listed that the claims that Lennart made were true, but were limited to those 2 days that he observed only, and the electronic equipment transported was not of a military weapon nature. The contents and country of origin are only known to the Minister of Defense. Weirdly, though, when the Minister of Defense was questioned regarding the chain of command regarding the handling of the equipment on board the Estonia, he claimed he couldn't remember, and this was odd considering he was known to be a man who prided himself on attention to detail and memory. When asked about the evidence that was not addressed in the report, he claimed he chose not to submit it to the investigation. He chose to only release his report on the evidence he felt was relevant, and then he said he burned the rest. That was literally a first for the nation of Sweden. Prior to this, there were no known cases where the government chose to destroy evidence in a case that they were investigating. The Swedish government began to come to the conclusion that whatever arrangement the armed forces had for transporting military equipment via a passenger ship like Estonia, it was not done by their regular intelligence unit, but most likely by their highly secretive Office of Procurement, also known as KSI, which is Sweden's secret spy organization, I suppose. They operated independently from the government and explained why the Swedish government had no knowledge of the Estonia transport. Now, this information corroborated what Stephen's sources from MI6 had told him 6 years before the chief of customs came forward in 2004, being that the Swedish government admitted to the claims of smuggling on the days Leonard stated, and only those days we know for certain that smuggling was happening. So it's not much of a reach to say that the Russian warning accusations hold water. But what Stephen says is that his sources confirm that the night of the sinking, another shipment was in fact on board the Estonia. But rather than electronic devices like previously claimed, his source states that crucial Russian intel on their missile program and important electronic components pertaining to that program were being smuggled out. His source says that if this was the case, the second senior Swedish intelligence got wind of the sinking, they would have gone directly to the Prime Minister and told them that the idea of salvaging the Estonia needs to be buried immediately. When you hear that, suddenly all the weird handlings of the sinking by these commissions and investigators and the Prime Minister literally walking back his promise and giving half-assed reasons and bullying into not salvaging kind of all starts to make some sense. Of course, this wouldn't be a complete theory if we didn't have eyewitness testimony to support it, right? Well, guess what? We do. We have several, actually. A survivor aboard the ship, a female passenger, recalls boarding the ship and putting her things away in her cabin that was in the hole, like the bottom level. When she finished, she looked at her watch and realized that the ship was running late because it hadn't taken off from port yet. She was curious, so she headed to the top deck to take a look around to see what was holding everything up. She says she spotted a motorway of several motorcycles leading 2 or 3 military green vehicles with that tented back kind of cargo area. I'm not sure what you'd call those type of vehicles, but she describes them. And she says she saw them speeding down the dock. They came to a stop in front of the car deck ramp and were speaking to port loaders. Her story was corroborated by another man who was aboard the ship and was actually running late to catch the ship. He states military personnel stopped his taxi from getting to the ship, so he had to run the last several hundred feet down the dock and was the last passenger to board through the passenger boarding area. On the top deck, he noticed the same military vehicles getting loaded onto the boat. He said after the sinking in Sweden, he received a phone call that threatened him and told him never to return to Estonia, and he has since never done so. Another perspective comes from the police investigator at the time who spoke on camera stating that the holdup at the dock was the fact that the ship crew did not want to permit military personnel on the boat to accompany these vehicles. Eventually, an order came down that overrode their halting, and a couple military men boarded with the cargo. The female passenger does confirm this. After the vehicles were loaded up, the ship began departing. So essentially, the late scheduled departure was further proof of the military equipment aboard. Now, what was not publicly announced back when the Rockwater diving investigation happened in early December of 1994 was that their investigation was not the first dive conducted after the sinking. Apparently, unbeknownst to everybody, the public, the government, everybody, a dive was performed 4 days after the sinking. It's unclear who performed it country-wise, but the images have a timestamp of October 2nd, 1994. I guess what really made the hairs stand up on the necks of people who saw this footage, including the former member of a Swedish parliament, was that in regard to the loading ramp in the bow, the railings were sawn off completely and just laying there on the seabed. This is apparently not normal and does not coincide with the accident findings up to that point or the investigation that was performed by the government a few months later. There should have been no reason for them to be sawed off and laying outside the ship, according to Langstrom, the parliament member. And given its state, this meant that someone obviously wanted access to the cargo deck. They did not come off in the sinking that had happened 4 days prior. Given the information we now know, and according to Lars, who was viewing the footage, the only people who would desire access to cargo areas of the ship would be military personnel for either government and or military reasons. It is curious as to when they found time between the time of the sinking and 4 days later to come and cut the rails off and get inside without nobody knowing. I mean, the sinking was massively covered by the media. I imagine there had to have been ships and helicopters circling the area during this time. It's amazing that this went undetected. It did bring the attention to the Swedish Parliament Court in 2006. The new representative that replaced Inez in the original Accident Commission investigation was a woman named Mona Sahlin. Mona fervently denied any knowledge of this unauthorized dive and insisted that she had no one working to hide anything regarding the sinking. Lars countered with the fact that she was still not answering his questions and that the evidence alone should reopen the investigation, and both Mona and the rest of Parliament ultimately dismissed this request. Now we are up to 2019. This is the time where Henrik Evertsson, journalist and director of this explosive docuseries I keep referring to, has entered the picture. Henrik has already started working on the documentary at this time, and he has now reached the point where they are ready to take the investigation to the wreck site. Like previous attempts before them, they decide to hire a German boat and some crew members, although I believe 2 of the documentary crew were Swedish citizens. They head to the site, and of course, they are met with government officials who are already guarding the site. They make contact with them and let them know who they are and what they are intending to do there. Surprisingly, the Coast Guard lets them have access. They move about half a mile away and are obviously keeping a close eye on them. They do ask if they had any Swedish or Finnish or Estonian citizens aboard, and they do let them know and make them aware that it is a crime in those countries to dive to the site. They obviously waive the right regardless and move half a mile away and keep an eye on the documentary team as they begin to delve to the ship. They're using roves, which are those like robotic swimming machines that have lights attached to them and document footage that they can see, so they didn't send any physical divers down there. They reached the ship with the rove shortly after 7 p.m. and it makes contact with the ship at the bow thrusters area, or the front propeller section, I guess. After confirming their location at the wreck, they proceed to head to the area of the ship that they suspect this elusive hull damage should be. The seabed in this area is made up of a type of sea clay, so as time has passed, it has shifted the position of the ship as it lays on its side. It's kind of slowly rolled, I guess, and as of today, it lies almost completely upside down when originally it landed on its starboard side. But because of this, it has exposed more of the hull that we were previously not able to observe. The rove traces the baseline of the ship along the now somewhat accessible starboard hull side. It gets to about 2/3 of the way down the ship where it suddenly stops. Something is immediately different than the rest of the couple hundred feet of the hull that they had just traced. You can see it, there's this sudden drop off into darkness. Now keep in mind, this rove is not much bigger than, say, a drone or those like iRobot self-vacuum machines that, skitter around your house. I would say the rove in particular that they use is maybe twice the size of one of those items. It's not big enough to fit even a child in it. They're tiny. So its field of range isn't much bigger than, the average person's. So in order to verify what they're seeing, the rove decides to back up and refollow its path just to make sure that it didn't, steer off course, or it's maybe further down the ship than it thought. But everything is correct. So they decide to zoom out and pull away from the wreck to discover what it is they've happened upon. And what they found is this massive hole. Massive. From what was ultimately documented by the footage, the hole was roughly 13 feet wide and 65 feet long. It's located just below the Estonia writing on the starboard side of the ship. Part of the S can even be seen in the footage. There's crumpled up fabric that is coming out of the hole that seems to be maybe towels that were inside the ship. And it's just ripped wide open. The team is immediately disturbed by this finding. I don't think they were expecting to find something of this size. The prior teams that had visited, remember, had found maybe, a 2 foot, 4 foot. I'm not even sure they gave dimensions, but at least based on the pictures, it wasn't a ginormous hole, but it indicated that there was a hole. They weren't able to confirm more because at the time there was little of the starboard side of the boat exposed. Obviously, this is 10 years later, and it has shifted since then. But the team decides to document all of the damage extensively to the best of their abilities, and ultimately they return just in time as the Coast Guard begins to start getting a little restless and kind of poking at them more to get out of the area. Now, with these new findings, they decide they want to make sure that they fact check these before publishing them or including them in the documentary. So they send the footage to a specialist who works on ship damage and physics and all of that sort of stuff. With the given information he was presented, the specialist is able to create a 4D model of the ship with the damage to scale. It's actually horrifying to see. But the damage is a very unique type of damage. You see this massive indentation of impact coming from outside the ship inward. It's almost like a massive oval lake shape at the top of the hole. But then it splits into the ship downwards, almost like a deformed lightning bolt shape. It's the best way I can describe it. The specialist calculates the amount of force needed to create this type of damage that the boat sustained, and he reveals that this could not have been caused by something like the bow visor crashing into the ship after it was ripped off, or floating debris, or even some sort of oceanic object like a rock. I think some of the examples he gave were something close in size to a small freighter or commercial vessel weighing between 1,000 and 5,000 tons. Tons. Now, they give the information also to a military explosives expert to review the damage and to kind of give some more insight on whether this damage could have been caused by an explosion. And while he cannot 100% rule out an explosion causing it, he finds it highly unlikely, which when you look at the hole, even to me, it's clear it's an impact hole. It's not an explosion hole. Now, to go even a step further, the documentary team also pulled analysis on the seabed over the past 25 years to see if maybe the composition or radar reports of the seabed floor had picked up on, maybe a giant rock or something hard that laid on the floor of the seabed that the ship could have landed on when it settled onto the floor that night it sunk. Again, this part of the seabed floor is all clay. For the most part, it's smooth with nothing capable of creating this type of damage. This really puts into perspective all of the events of the last 25 years for the people of these countries, the victims, and everyone involved. You can no longer deny a hole in the hull of this ship. The question is, what do you do with this information? Well, the documentary was released in 2020. The uproar it caused pushed the government into officially reopening another investigation into the sinking. This time, with all the brand new people touching this investigation, there should be no doubt in anyone's mind that the truth should come out. Now, the findings that they have found so far, as of 2021, found that there was indeed a hole, but that the hole is actually even bigger than what the documentary team had found. My assumption is, again, the shifting of the boat on the softer seabed floor, which is, like I said, it's almost completely upside down now, laying on the seabed floor. But it's still not completely exposing any remaining damage caused by the hole. It is estimated that this hole is now about 19 feet wide and 130 feet long. But there is no definitive answer as to what caused this hole. Experts from the currently ongoing investigation have mentioned that they think it's possible that the hole was caused by the bow detachment. But when the documentary team took it to the third-party specialist 3 years prior, where the hole size at the time was known to be smaller, this expert debunked that theory. On top of that, the damage on the bow visor was not consistent with impact with the ship in this manner. It had friction marks on the bridge of it, but that was proven to be from repetitive opening of it and it scraping on the bottom side of the top deck that it would rest on. As of today, their new investigation still appears to be ongoing. There hasn't been any new updates aside from the newfound larger calculations of the hole. There's still no new ruling as to the cause of the sinking. The official original report still remains until this one concludes. But speculation obviously continues. Out of all of the theories regarding the sinking, the official report of the visor malfunction, the Meyer shipyard theory of explosives sinking the ship, or, the third most recent theory we just covered of a collision, whether accidental or intentional, leading to a hole in the hull. I'd say the hole in the hull is the most likely scenario for me. After listening and reading many witness accounts, documents, testimonies, tests that were performed, and just using straight up logic, here's my take on it. I think that the Estonia was secretly exporting illegal military goods out of Russia. I think that it's possible that this was happening outside of the normal government knowledge and was possibly linked to other countries' secret military branches. I think that Russia became aware and warned Estonia and Sweden, and I think these warnings were ignored. I think that the night that the ship sank, it collided with an underwater vessel. I feel like if it were a ship, it would have been spotted or in the vicinity when the ship sank. Given how quickly it did sink, it wouldn't have been able to just disappear or flee that quickly. And honestly, given the size of the damage, I don't see any other explanation. I think that the illogical acts of the Swedish government only fed these suspicions further by them performing, these half-assed public delves and secretly performing, their own versions, sliding under the radar and then burning all the evidence. They refused to retrieve the dead, even though it was completely possible. They attempted to bury the ship in concrete and declared the area a gravesite, and, this whole sanctity act and banning people from diving to it. For them to go to these lengths to hide info just reconfirms that they knew the ship sank for other reasons. I really do hope this investigation will finally expose the truth. People should be able, to ride a passenger ship and return home safely. And, people should have their loved ones brought home after tragically dying out on the sea. I can't imagine what these families have gone through. But anyway, that concludes the Vanishing of the Viking Sally / the Estonia. This episode wraps up the 3-part series. We will be starting a new case coming next episode. Most likely back to, unsolved murders or disappearances that I have lined up. But I do want to know what you guys think happened to the Estonia. What theories made sense? Which ones didn't? Does this confirm there are such things as cursed ships? Who knows? Let me know on our YouTube channel, Twitter, or Instagram. In the meantime, stay safe, guys, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Vanishing Hour.